Rain poured relentlessly over the dark highway, turning the night into a blur of reflections and danger. Mark Dalton gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes narrowing against the streaks of rain lashing across the windshield. His old pickup truck coughed and rattled, but it kept going, much like him. The worn-out wipers squeaked in rhythm, fighting the storm as if refusing to surrender. On the passenger seat sat a small backpack, a teddy bear, and a folded note from his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. "Good night, Daddy. Don't forget my story." The words were scribbled in pink marker, the I in Daddy shaped like a heart. He smiled softly at the memory of her sleepy face before he'd left for his night shift. She was all he had and all he needed. Mark worked 2 jobs and a mechanic by day, security guard by night, ever since his wife passed away 3 years ago. Every dollar he earned went to keeping Lily in school, keeping their tiny apartment warm, and keeping the world from crushing them completely. As he turned onto the old bridge road that cut through the valley, lightning cracked across the sky, and then he saw it. A black luxury SUV had crashed into the guardrail, half its front end hanging dangerously over the river below. Its headlights flickered weakly through the rain. Without a second thought, Mark pulled over, jumped out, and sprinted toward the wreckage. The storm howled around him, rain soaking through his clothes as he yanked open the door. Inside was a man in his late 50s, bleeding from the forehead, struggling to stay conscious. The smell of gasoline was sharp in the air. "Hey, sir, can you hear me?" Mark shouted over the storm. The man groaned weakly. "Help, can't move my leg." Mark saw the crumpled metal pinning the man's leg. He didn't hesitate. He shoved his shoulder against the bent frame, straining with all his strength. The metal groaned, cutting into his arms, but he pushed harder. The car shifted an inch, then another. Finally, with one last heave, he freed the man's leg and dragged him out just as the SUV groaned and tipped forward. In seconds, the vehicle plunged into the river below, disappearing into the raging current. Both men collapsed on the muddy road, gasping. "You saved me," the man panted. "Yeah," Mark said between breaths, but we're not done yet. You need a hospital." Mark helped him to his truck, threw a blanket around his shoulders, and drove through the storm toward the nearest hospital, 30 miles away. The man kept drifting in and out of consciousness, murmuring fragments of words. "Board meeting. Stocks, my daughter." Mark didn't ask questions. He just drove faster. When they finally reached the hospital, nurses rushed out, pulling the injured man onto a stretcher. Before Mark could even give his name, the chaos of flashing lights and shouting staff surrounded him. "You saved his life," one of the nurses said, amazed. "Do you know who that was?" Mark shook his head, wiping the rain from his face. "That's Richard Callaway, the billionaire founder of Callaway Industries." Mark froze. He'd seen the name on magazines, news sites, business channels, a man worth billions, whose company practically ran half the city. He glanced at the hospital doors as they swung closed behind the gurney. But instead of following, Mark quietly turned back to his truck. He had to get home. Lily would wake up soon, and he'd promised her pancakes. By the time the sun rose, Mark was back in his small apartment. Lily ran to him, arms wide, laughing. "Daddy, you're home!" He smiled, picking her up. "Always, kiddo, always." He didn't mention the accident. He just made her breakfast, kissed her forehead, and took her to school. It was another day, ordinary, quiet, and exactly how he liked it. But across town, Richard Callaway woke up in a hospital bed with one question on his mind. Who saved me? His assistant told him no name had been given. The hospital cameras had been damaged by the storm. The man had disappeared before anyone could ask. For weeks, Richard searched. He used private investigators, checked every hospital record, even offered a reward. Nothing. The mysterious rescuer seemed to have vanished. Months passed. Richard recovered, but something in him changed. He'd spent his life chasing money, success, and control. But that night reminded him how fragile it all was. He owed his life to a man who didn't even want to be known. Then one afternoon, fate intervened again. Mark was at his mechanic shop, covered in grease, fixing an old sedan when a sleek black car pulled up outside. A man in a suit stepped out, followed by another familiar face, Richard Callaway himself. Mark froze. "Mr. Dalton?" Richard asked, his tone both formal and warm. Yeah," Mark said, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's me." Richard smiled faintly. You're hard to find. Mark shrugged. Didn't think anyone was looking. You saved my life, Richard said quietly. I've been searching for months to thank you. Mark looked down, embarrassed. Did what anyone would have done. Not everyone would risk their life for a stranger in a storm, Richard replied. You did. And I don't forget debts. He gestured to his assistant, who handed Mark an envelope. Inside was a check, the amount enough to change his entire life. Mark's eyes widened. Sir, I can't take this. It's not charity, Richard said firmly. It's gratitude. You gave me time I wouldn't have had. Let me do the same for you. Mark hesitated, then handed the envelope back. Thanks, but my little girl needs her dad, not money. I'm fine as long as she's okay. Richard was silent for a long moment. You remind me of someone I used to be. He left, but the memory of that man, that simple, humble mechanic, and stayed with him. Weeks later, Mark received a letter. Inside was a job offer, not just any job, but a senior technician position at Callaway Industries, with a salary triple what he was earning, full benefits, and a scholarship for his daughter's future. There was no signature, only a short note. For the man who showed me what real worth means. Mark stared at the letter for a long time. He didn't need fame, didn't want attention, but this could change Lily's life. He accepted the job quietly, never mentioning the past to anyone. Years went by. Lily grew up, went to college, and later joined Callaway Industries herself. By then, Richard Callaway had retired, but one day, he showed up at a small graduation ceremony, old but smiling. Lily, surprised, introduced herself. Mr. Callaway, I've heard so much about your company. My dad works there too. He smiled knowingly. I know, young lady. Your father once saved my life. She froze. What? Richard looked at her with warmth. He never told you, did he? Lily shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. Richard chuckled softly. He wouldn't. Men like your father don't do things for credit. They just do what's right. When Lily told her father later that evening, Mark only smiled. That night's long gone, sweetheart. What matters is the life we built after. But as she hugged him, she whispered, I'm proud of you, Dad. He kissed her forehead and said, You're the reason I did everything. Across town, in a quiet mansion, Richard Callaway sat by his window watching the sunset. On his desk was an old newspaper clipping. The storm, the crash, the headline, Billionaire saved in mysterious rescue, beneath. It was a single note in his handwriting. Sometimes the richest men are the ones who have the least, but give the most. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself, Thank you, Mark Dalton. And somewhere in a modest home filled with laughter and love, Mark tucked his grown daughter's old teddy bear into a box, looked around their warm little living room, and whispered back, You're welcome. The storm that brought two lives together had long passed, but its echo remained, quietly reminding both men that real wealth isn't measured in money, but in moments of courage, kindness, and silence. Because sometimes heroes don't wait for applause. They save a life and walk away without a word.